Hey Dean, how's it going? All right, Dean, I'm waiting to see what you pick to talk about. This should be interesting.
I thought it was like an interview.
Oh, is it? No, don't be stressed. So I tell this to literally everybody who does this, which is the best we should definitely hope for in this is that the person who I'm interviewing has a fun conversation, has a like a really deep, fulfilling conversation, and that's it. It's not like we're like doing this for an audience or anything.
That's super awesome.
Hmm. So, Dean, you're a man of rich tastes and varied tastes. Is that not true? You could be talking about a million things right now.
Well, I think when you and I went out for a drink, we proved that we had a million things to talk about.
That's absolutely right. That was a really fun evening.
I liked it. It's really kind of breathtaking that such evenings are impossible for people geographically separated for the foreseeable future.
I know. I'm in a place emotionally where I've stopped putting timelines on it.
Yeah,
It's indefinite future now.
yeah, yeah. Learn how to live with it, not in the yeah, go ahead, I'm going to get infected sense, but into
No.
be really careful for a long time.
This also helps, by the way. Like whenever whichever weekends I do podcasts, I generally find myself to be more peppy, more happy.
Yeah, we had a house guest a couple weeks ago now, I guess,
Mm.
for the first time since COVID.
Hmm.
And we were super careful. Like she was not low risk because customers and
Okay.
so we were super high precautions, but with a house guest. Like
That's yeah, that's tricky.
she was comfortable sleeping on the screen porch because she camps a lot and has lived in the Amazon a lot.
Oh
And
wow.
so,
That's
like,
fascinating.
she would come in the house only briefly, and we would all wear masks when she was in the house. And mostly we spent our time together on the screen porch, or it was a very careful, but we had a house guest, so kind of wild.
I could see that. I could see like a writer in 15 years writing like stories from quarantine. And like one of the stories is about like a house guest to live on the porch. Like that's such a slice of life kind of representative story.
One thing I've been wondering, and feel free to divert this if you get to such a point, but one thing I've been wondering is, will this period exist in like TV shows, or will it
Oh.
kind of be edited out?
I, if nothing else, as is the case, it should live on in comedy because the darkest things that happen do live on through humor.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Will you have dramas in the future where, like, you have a whole season of 12 episodes and nobody leaves their house visibly, and there are lots of video calls? I mean, I don't know how you make a drama like that, but that's our life right now.
I could definitely see, I mean, have you read the classic novel Love in the Time of Cholera?
No, I have
So,
not.
so I could
Lauren's shaking
see,
her hands, though.
yeah, I could see basically something where it's part of a grander story where the disease forms a backdrop to some intense romance. I think that kind of thing could definitely work out.
Yeah, very
Mhm.
true.
Mhm. So, Dean, what's on your mind? What do you want to bring up?
Huh. What do I want to bring up? Do I want to bring anything up? Let's see. It's it's easy to be drawn towards talking about work things, and I try to think whether that's gonna work out well, or not be ideal.
I
Um,
know there's a natural, like with you, there's obviously the elephant in the room of the conversation of entrepreneurship, right? And I don't know how much of that is because this is the pitch. Have the conversation you want to have. If you are also sick of the subject, I don't just need to talk about it just because it's something that is a big facet of your personality.
So I have a proposal.
Okay.
Oddly enough, why don't we talk about politics?
Great. I'd love to talk about politics. I'm not, heads up, I don't know much about politics other than the concept in terms of the real world politics that happen in the world. I mean, obviously, I'm okay with saying I don't like the current president.
Yeah, I mean, so here's a way that we could approach that. Like, it's easy to get angry and kind of specifically frustrated at a lot of the things that people are doing in the world right now. You know, it's
Mhm.
really easy to get angry and frustrated at things that Trump does, or you know, the people who scorn wearing masks and are really aggressive about their right to walk into establishments without wearing masks. You know, things like that are really
Mhm.
easy to get angry about, for me at least. Um, but if you step back from that, uh, if you step back from that, you can just kind of ask, where are we as a society in the United States? And how does, you know, if you just kind of look at us as a body, like you look at all of the people in the United States as a body, you can ask where that body is, like what are its healths and dishealths. And you can also ask questions like, how does that relate to where things stand in the rest of the world? You know, are there worldwide healthy and unhealthy aspects that the United States is just reflecting in particular ways, or is it unique and idiosyncratic?
If we step back even more and make it a little bit more personal, was there a time, have you always been interested in politics? Is it something you thought about when you were in high school and college? Like at what point in your life did you even start thinking about it deeply?
Great question. Um, so it was episodic and not very deep until Obama's campaign. And then I was kind of fundamentally interested in that. And then at the beginning of his time in office, I was kind of fundamentally interested in how he would approach it. But then after the first 2 years, I felt like I kind of understood how he would approach it, which you know, may seem like a ridiculous glossing over of, but in retrospect, I don't think it was wrong. You know, I think you could kind of look at his first 2 years and extrapolate pretty accurately. And I think then I went back to episodic and not very deep. But but like I think a lot of people, the fact that we elected a black man as president really made me feel like, okay, you know, we've established a new high water mark. Even as tolerance recedes, you know, even as it ebbs and flows in the future, you know, we'll never get back to what was really bad. And at some level, in theory, I expected there to be backlash. But then I think that as we watched Trump's campaign, you know, I thought it was ludicrous. I thought it was laughable. And then I thought he was extraordinarily unlikely to win, even up to election night. And I comforted Lauren that he wasn't going to win. And now she is adamant that I will never have any credibility about any election whatsoever. Um, but I think that once Trump won, then all of a sudden it seemed really important to understand what was going on at many different levels.
Dean, how do you consume politics? Like you're forming all these opinions and you have sort of an idea of the milieu, right? How is it network TV? Is it a certain publication that you really like? How are these ideas even congealing in your head?
Yeah, it's a certain set of news websites, basically. Like up until very recently, my staples were the Washington Post and New York Times. And then there's kind of a ring further around that, like 538. Occasionally Real Clear Politics, occasionally deliberate forays into more conservative material, some very liberal material like The Atlantic. Um, and then over time, although I comfortably rely on the reporting of New York Times and Washington Post, their front pages increasingly annoy me because they're really selling their anti-Trump editorial material from just terms of how they position things more than the news. And just recently, I've been finding Axios to be a total breath of fresh air. Like it's so much better a way to actually consume news. And as of the past couple of weeks, I actually use Axios as how I get news. And then I glance at the New York Times or Washington Post to see if there's any editorial material I want to read, or deep reporting. I mean, you know, those two outlets will still do deep reporting that Axios can't typically do. So sometimes I look at that as well.
Yeah, I think that naturally segues into a topic that a lot of people tend to bring up these days, which is the consumption of politics is as segregated as it ever has been, basically. Like you have online echo chambers, people consume exactly the same kind of information that already reinforces what they know. And there's this one question that I really like, which is how many people would you really call close friends that are on the other side of the fence? Like, are you regularly talking to a Republican?
So I'll answer that question in a minute, but kind of the first thing that you mentioned first, yeah, I'm very conscious that I'm consuming outlets that have a very definite liberal point of view. The one thing that I do that breaches that fairly thoroughly is I pretty reliably listen to Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace's interviews, and I'm I maintain my motivation to do it. Like I do it in principle because I feel like I actually feel like he's exceedingly balanced. Like I feel like he's just total, like I'm gonna have the same interviewing style with a liberal politician, with a conservative politician. It's just, it is what it is, right? But that would be a reason in principle for watching it. But in practice, he actually interviews like really senior Republican people, you know, members of Trump's administration and so on, which I don't get a lot of in the news outlets that I normally look at. But no, I don't have any close friends who are taking today's Republican point of view. You know, I have like one close friend who has been Republican all of his life, but he's really disavowed what's happening today. And to be totally frank, I view it as a moral issue. You know, I feel like, and I mean, this is me articulating the polarization of the day, and yet I believe it, that I feel like the Republican Party has gone way beyond what's actually moral.
So the whole idea that this all started with a bunch of people who maybe are not that urban and are maybe on the conservative side thought in 2016 that, all right, we're just going to elect Trump as a big FU to the coasts that think that they know everything. And now that we don't even know these people personally, how are we ever going to bring them back or them to our side? They consume all of these outlets that are echo chambers for conservative media. They don't have any close friends who would actually have a empathetic conversation with them. Their economic forecast certainly isn't looking that great. What is going to change about that?
So I have a brother-in-law named Joe. And early in Trump's time in office, I put an immense amount of energy into trying to understand why Joe is an avid Trump supporter, and trying to persuade him. And my experience across maybe a year of engaging that pretty strongly is that, I mean, from my perspective, there was nothing I could say. There was nothing I could say. Like, for starters, it was super hard because any article that I put in front of him, he would immediately, like, his first response would be, "Yeah, that's a liberal outlet, so forget it. I don't even want to read that." Um, and since I don't consume a lot of, I don't even want to say conservative anymore. I don't think that's what Republicans are anymore. So since I don't consume a lot of Republican leaning outlets, I don't have ready material on hand written by Republican leaning outlets. So what I would tend to go to then was just like Trump's speeches, like go to the source material and have the discussion on that basis. But even there, it's just like, there was nothing, no conversation that I would have that he would move on at all. And I read an article recently in the New York Times, I think, uh, that that really affected, or I don't know, it resonated with ways I had been thinking about this, and it really kind of brought me back to a focus on certain points. And the idea that it talked about was costly signaling. So the idea is that to be in a group and to feel that group bond, group members are expected to go out and signal to others um, in ways that show their allegiance to the group and that are not free, that cost them something, right? So like, if you wear ear discs that are stretching the lobe of your ear permanently, like that's a great example of costly signaling. Like that is not free, um, right? But then in a political context, the point that they make is if you say, I'm trying to think of a good example. If you say, our freedom to bear arms is really important. And although there are practical problems of safety, it's fundamental and we have to preserve it. Like you paid no cost, right? That was not a costly signaling. So that does not show your allegiance to a group, right? Whereas if you say, um, it is urgent that we withhold funding from the post office because the post office is going to be used to deliver fraudulent ballots, right? The vast majority of Americans, like literally the post office gets the highest favorables of any government institution, right? So that's a really costly signal to send. Um, so I feel like that's one big thing that's happening. Like when I try to talk with my brother-in-law, he has to signal to me. It's a group thing. And maybe although I'm oblivious, I do the same. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't like to think so, but maybe. But then going back to your original question, well, okay, let me take your original question back to my original opening, which is what's the underlying ailment? And I would offer I would offer some hypotheses, most of which I have not authored, which is that things that have happened include people becoming disconnected from each other at a human level, people leaving physical communities and underappreciating the importance of physical communities and self-segregating, and just all of these different things that mean that there are fewer deep human bonds. And then something that my wife Lauren has pointed out a lot, even before Trump, but especially during Trump, is that the ability to pick and choose your community, as opposed to this is your physical neighborhood, so it is your community. Um, uh, it it means that you're not embedded in a web of relationships with people of fundamentally different circumstances and different points of view. And then also interacting with people online means that you feel safer from societal disapproval. So you feel better about acting like a jerk in various ways because it doesn't sort of literally come home to roost as much. And then I think the erosion of authority is a real and deep thing. You know, although I am not a churchgoer, I think churches have served a useful authority role. I think they've caused a lot of problems too, but I think they've served a useful authority role. You know, Dan Rather, the fact, I mean, everybody points this out, but the fact that as a nation, we all used to sit down and watch Dan Rather and get the same point of view together in an authoritative kind of a way. So I think my broader answer is that I think we have to find ways of healing societal ills. I don't think that persuasion, I don't think it's that you can put more energy into how you try to build consensus when you do interact with people. I mean, I think you should. I think that's good. But I don't, you know, I don't think we can just all be better at talking about it and it'll all be okay. I think there are fundamental societal rifts that we have to find leverage on. Boy, that was a long answer on my part.
I love letting guests talk. I think it's one of the best things there is. And only like to interject if you feel like, hi, feel like I need a question to keep going. To bring in some of your own expertise and really extended experience from the tech community, you know as well as I do that the giants out there, Facebook, for example, especially, is hell bent and has some of the smartest people in the world working on basically getting your attention and linking you to articles that you really would like to consume. Just like the junk food or the sugar industry really wants you to eat that as opposed to some healthy food. Do you think in some sense this is like we are trying to stand up against them? Like they're not going to stop serving that content to people.
So I would answer yes, but I would broaden the topic. One of my biggest and most sustained concerns has been that institutions of many kinds have been getting better at manipulating the population at the exponential rate of technological advance. And I think the population is getting better at resisting, but at the rate of generational advance. So like, I think teenagers today are more skeptical and more cynical about what they get from online outlets than their parents were, right? But you're talking like a 20 to 30 year time period for that change. Whereas I think that everything from the technical giants that you mentioned to political campaigns, like national political campaigns, to the ways that companies operate and the ways that they use advertising and the ways that they use like loyalty points and things like that. I think all of those things are probably getting twice as good at manipulating every 5 years, you know, while the population gets 30% better at resisting manipulation every 25 years. And I worried even like long before Trump about, I would just ask the question, like, where does this lead? You know, as those trends move, where does that come out? And I think we have an interim answer now to where that comes out. But boy, you can imagine it getting a lot worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and I think just to give a concrete data point towards technology companies are getting better at serving the content they think you will like and pushing you into an echo chamber. On Facebook, you at least have to go like some pages, or you have some friends you need to add manually who are then going to share articles that you like. Now with the likes of TikTok, it literally maximizes just view time on the video. And you never like or follow or do, you just swipe up on the video and it directly is connecting the content to your deeper fears, needs, desires in a way that is not might not even be clear to yourself.
Yeah, that's pretty terrifying. I had not known enough about TikTok to say what you just said.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, apart from the security concerns and all of the other things that governments are bringing up too. I know India banned TikTok. My own country, Pakistan, has been thinking about banning TikTok, although those views are probably based in other political sort of like needs as opposed to thinking about how it's actually segregating people. But yeah, that's definitely the world we are heading in. And TikTok is no smart machine learning algorithm. It's still what was true of technology 5 years ago. It's just that they've applied the business model really, really well, and they understand that. Well, there's the social network that got to 1 billion users fastest ever.
So here's an example that I find it fascinating that I never see this in the news. Um, Lauren had a habit of subscribing to some like Republican mailing list, kind of taking some actions in their campaign environment on the principle of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And she's done that enough that she gets a lot of Trump campaign email, and she gets to see how it's framed, and she gets to see how much of it there is, and there's an immense amount of it. And the general framing is here is how your way of life is threatened. And of course, we both know how your way of life is threatened, and here's why you must rely on Trump to save that way of life. And here's the action that you need to take right now. You need to donate, you need to get a ticket for this event, whatever it is that you need to do. And so some decently high percentage of the population, like some tens of percent of US citizens, I've got to believe, get that sort of email daily, right? And some of them will blow it off, to varying degrees, some high, but an awful lot of it, I've got to believe, will sit and read it, right? So if 20% of the US population is regularly reading and thinking about and being jazzed up emotionally by that kind of material. And there again, it's the same kind of a thing, right? It's more traditional than what you described for TikTok in that it's based on actions, but they're totally using machine learning. I'm just I'm stating this by assumption, but they're totally using machine learning. They have calls to actions, they have material, they get correlations on the material versus your action on the calls to actions, right? It's just total ball manipulation. But then the thing that I said early in this thread is the news doesn't talk about that. They talk about Trump's tweets, but they don't talk about what's in those campaign emails that tens of percent of US voters are consuming every day.
That makes a lot of sense, Dean. And I got a little taste of that myself when I got my green card fairly recently, about a year ago. And the way I celebrated was I donated to Bernie, and it was like this, because then you can donate. You can actually, you're not considered an alien anymore. You can actually contribute to political campaigns, even though you still cannot vote. And that opted me in to basically the mailing list. And basically, a couple of donations in, I donated many, many times. The email became very targeted to the size of the donations I would make, to the
Uh,
frequency of the donations I would make. And every time it would be an email, I would get an email at least every 2 to 3 days that would lay out the next milestone, the next tour that he's doing, the next place that he's going to. And with always a starting paragraph that gets you riled up against the millionaires and the billionaires. And then a paragraph for how I am really important as part of this campaign. And then ending with a one-click button that I can just click in the email to instantly give some money, and then ending with a screen that says, "Would you like to make this recurring?"
so yeah. So where do we land in 15 years?
That is a question I would say in all of human history, this is probably the hardest time to look forward 15 years. Like as you go further and further back, the horizon of 15 years, 1,000 years ago, nothing's going to change in 15 years.
Right.
Absolutely nothing. Maybe a few, maybe we might get hit with a natural disaster we don't know about. Today, I don't even know how broader technological forces are going to play into it, like automation, how climate change is going to play into it, how I personally believe that the US was only the canary in the coal mine when it comes to this kind of segregation of society. And going back to your original question, this is happening all over the world because the problem of internet echo chambers is not just limited to the US. So I personally have a more pessimistic take on this, but I want to hear what you think.
Um, I don't think that being optimism has a lot of practical grounding right this minute. Like, I don't think you can be evidence-based optimist at this point. That said, um, I feel like positive change occurs when people see the alternative and find it so completely unacceptable that they move towards the positive change. For example, from a US perspective, and I can't really judge other countries except maybe Europe. Maybe I would be comfortable saying from a US and a European perspective, I feel as though the generation or two after World War II was way more enlightened than average, right? I feel like there was some honest altruism in the US psyche and in the European psyche. There was a willingness to invest serious dollars in trying to help make things better overseas in ways that didn't necessarily have obvious and immediate payback in national interest. And like everybody who says stuff like this, you have to caveat it by saying, were we also kind of nationally assholes during that time? Did we also go profiteer suffering, for our immediate self-interest? Sure, absolutely, no question. But I think that after World War II, there was a real and positive pendulum swing for a couple of generations towards a willingness to try to build positively in the world. And like one thing that I've thought about a lot with the environment and with climate change, as we've become increasingly aware of that as an important issue with the environment, is it's been clear for a long time that things would have to get really bad before people actually found it concerning enough to devote like serious dollars and serious attention to making it better. And then the question you have to ask is, does it have to get so bad that it's not recoverable? Or, how does that play out? And like with Trump's potential reelection, like from a sheer risk perspective, I consider it absolutely unacceptable to allow Trump to be reelected. Like I think the risk of nuclear war, the risk of the US just practically speaking, losing its democracy, the risk of all kinds of world ruptures, the risk of a huge pandemic that could kill, like, I don't know, 200,000 Americans plus lots of people in other parts of the world. I mean, somehow those risks just seem very real right now. But that said, although I think it's unacceptable from a risk perspective for him to win, at some level, I just wonder if we're done with him yet. Like, I wonder if people will adequately panic and I do think there's a fad going on here. I think that Trump supporters to some degree, once he's been out of office for a little while, or I don't know, at some point, I do expect a little bit of a like, whoa, how did we get there? But 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 the combination of people who were already appalled by his presidency having more power again, plus maybe some breaking of the spell amongst his adherents. Like, I'd like to think that we would be frightened enough from this that we would put in, like, for example, democracy preserving mechanisms that we lacked in our original founding and in existing amendments, right? But then at another level, like, I don't know, are we scared enough yet? It may be that only another 4 years of Trump would truly deeply frighten us enough that the pendulum would swing back strongly after that. But again, it's just too big a risk to take. You can't voluntarily take that risk, but I wonder.
I guess it's always tempting to keep focusing on the enemy, but to focus on the liberal side for a second. Are you happy with the Democratic Party's approach to everything? How they are trying to counter Trump?
Um, you know, I'm happy enough. Like, one of the things that is most important to me right now is that whatever Democrat has a chance of becoming president next would not take it as an opportunity to sort of take policy revenge. Would not take it as an opportunity to race towards a level of liberalism that's really substantially more liberal than the mean. I really would like to see a Democrat elected, anybody, but realistically, it would be a Democrat elected who would come into office and say, look, this has been kind of awful. We can disagree about why it was awful, but what we need to do now is remind ourselves that we're one nation, that we have a lot of common interests. We need to recognize that we hurt ourselves badly by just fighting about everything, and we need to find ways to move forward on common ground. And I would like to see the next president pursue centrist policies as a way of healing, even though I personally would greatly prefer more liberal policies. And I think I could imagine Biden being great at that. I can imagine him being the guy for the moment in that regard. So although I was somewhat disappointed to see some of the others fall by the wayside along the way, I'm optimistic that maybe this is Biden's time.
So, I mean, the likes of Mitch McConnell, the way they negotiate is never split the difference. And either you win or you shut things down. And the Democratic approach, as far as I know it, has been offer compromises, but never actually secure a compromise for yourself. How do you see that changing or not?
Well, the easiest story would be if we get the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And then I could imagine Biden being the one who leads the Democratic Party not to take big advantage of that. I could imagine Biden accommodating from that position of extreme strength. So I think that's the easiest story, right? I don't know if we didn't get the Senate, if we held the House and got the presidency but didn't get the Senate, which is, I don't know, it's probably the most likely single outcome right now. Then I feel like a lot of forward progress probably can't happen, but lack of forward progress is at least a little centrist in its own way. If Biden would adopt a widely embracing tone, if his tone would be forgiving and bringing together and reminding ourselves of common interest, it may be that nothing would come of that in terms of practical change. for however long Biden was in office, if the Senate was held by Republicans, but it might still be the right thing.
And not to even speak of the decisions that have been made that have much longer term consequences than a presidency here or there, like Kavanaugh, for example, and the Supreme Court the way it is right now. There must be other changes that have happened to the democratic process itself, which might be now with us for maybe 20 years, 25 years. Again, I feel like, is that something either the Republican Party is going to recover from, or is that something Democrats are going to do anything in terms of healing towards? Or is the Democratic approach, let's just take our base that we've always had and just try to rile it up as much as possible to say, not that guy?
I hope not. And there again, if you had to place a bet on somebody not to lead the Democratic Party in that direction, I think Biden would be a good person to bet on. In terms of healing, in terms of kind of healing the U.S. democracy, there's one whole category of things that a president could do, which is just entirely on the executive side. Like there's a lot of damage that's been done that's entirely on the executive side, and there's a lot of healing that could be done there in terms of agency leadership, in terms of rekindling agency missions, like having the EPA have a mission of preserving the environment, for example, crazy as that sounds. Right. So there's that whole category, which, even if we didn't gain the Senate, like Biden would have a lot of room to improve things in that area. And I'm confident that he would. I think there are also probably constitutional amendments. In fact, I feel sure there are constitutional amendments that need to come out of this. And frankly, that's such a long process that I would kind of argue that gaining the Senate doesn't even matter in that regard. Like it's probably a 15-year process to get major constitutional amendments in place. And I think the president will be in a position to start those discussions. And I think that the kinds of amendments that Donald Trump would propose to the Constitution would be really different from the kinds of amendments that Joe Biden would propose.
I guess I have an interesting question for you then. Me being an immigrant from a country where democracy has only had rule of the country for half the country's lifetime. The other half has been military dictators. And then also knowing of history and places like Chile and them basically being very secure in their democracy in the 60s and then going into like the darkness of military rule for decades, or what happened in Turkey with Erdogan coming in and basically wiping away 30 to 40% of the intelligentsia or the judges or people in politics who were his opponents. Two things. One, do you think Americans feel way too secure in democracy? And what are your personal reasons you either feel secure in your democracy or you don't? Because these things do happen to other countries where the democratic process goes away even.
So I don't feel at all secure in our democracy right now. Before Trump won, I had a lot of confidence that Americans had a really deeply ingrained sense that democracy is really important and our Constitution is really important. And my confidence in that is completely shattered at this point. I mean, the way
There's
that
there's an interesting statistic I read, which is of all developed democracies, the US has the lowest rate of participation in voting. It's between 50 and 60%, which again is quite concerning to me.
And that's a fascinating statistic. And if you were looking for a silver lining, that's not how this election is going to be. We do have a lot more civic interest right now than we did 3.5 years ago.
I would really like that number to be like at a 75% plus at least.
I've got to believe that we'll achieve that. in this election. We'll
Uh,
see. But but oh, so the way that I've recently been tending towards looking at this is kind of grim, which is that I feel like whites and especially white Christians in the U.S., but from majority perspective, it's really just whites in general. Um, I feel as though at some level, some mixture of conscious and unconscious, as a whole, they realize something. And if you look at my face, it's interesting that I say they, but there you go.
it's the royal day.
It's yeah, exactly. It's yeah, but but I think at some level they recognize that there will soon be more not strictly traditionally white than there are strictly traditionally white people in the US. And also that layered on top of that, the younger generations do tend toward more liberal in various ways. Um, and that at some level the traditionally regarded as white people recognize that a democracy is incompatible with their maintaining their position as the top of society. And I think that Trump's presidency, both the fact that it happened and then what we've experienced across his term in office, let's not say his first term, um, I think it's demonstrated that an awful lot of those folks ultimately would choose maintaining their privileged position at the expense of democracy rather than the other way around. Right now, there's a time limit on this. Like if democracy survives for 20 years, then this whole issue is past us. It's no longer a white majority. It's no longer whites entirely and clearly at the top of society. But I think there's just a period of risk where a lot of whites would rather see democracy fall if that's what it takes.
Yeah, and that to me is a very uniquely human problem and has been repeated in different times and different places over and over. Australia, up till very recently, much more so than the US, was very anti-immigration, very pro-white, would not even allow, for example, after Second World War, to have the war wives, Japanese war wives of their own soldiers to even live in Australia or come back to
Oh, I did
Australia.
not know that bit of history.
And then Japan, till today, struggles with not having enough of a labor force because of their aging population, but then also through a sheer lack of immigration. A really interesting piece of trivia that I know is the amount of immigration you have in a country is very directly correlated with the amount of Nobel Prize winners you have, because an overwhelming majority of Nobel Prize winners are either immigrants or kids of immigrants. Um,
That's
and
awesome.
and the US really has ridden that wave since the Second World War. And the reason we have some of the really strongest educational institutions is those educational institutions, since a long time, at this point, maybe close to 100 years, have not drawn lines based on race or immigration or whatnot. In fact, actively welcome smart people from other places and bring them and give them really high positions and a lot of authority. Um, that is something that I think the US absolutely needs to hold on to. And something that I've been concerned with is the paths to immigration to the US are degrading already. A lot of the people that I know who would have picked a grad school program here are choosing Canada or are choosing Germany. And that's worrying.
You know, in a way, it's amazing that you and I had this much of our conversation without mentioning the phrase electoral college. Um, you know, I think a really difficult reality is that it's in the cities, especially the bigger cities, that people really live and experience a mix of national and racial origins and a deep mix of perspectives. And I think that that those environments really end up believing deeply that that's a good thing. I mean, the obvious ones, New York City or most of California, right? People who really live that reality, really believe in that reality. But the electoral college system means that it's not about number of votes, it's about which states in particular. And the states that don't experience that mixing are really afraid of it.
Do you think that's a place where the fact that the US has one of the longest standing democracies in the world plays against it, because some of these rules were instituted when the population distribution looked very different from the way it is today? And really, originally, the Electoral College was put into place to protect some of those states, and now ends up giving them the power to, well, bullying is a strong word, but bully a lot of the populace at large.
Yeah, there's there's deep history around why we're not a straight democracy, why we're a federal system with states having carefully allocated votes. And I don't know how long, like, how big can the difference be between the popular vote and the winner in the presidency before that's just completely unsustainable? And if it's completely unsustainable, what does that even mean? Like, honestly, I'm sort of thankful and sort of terrified that the blue territories are on opposite sides of the continent, because if the blue territories were all on one side of the continent, then I think it's clear cut that we would break up as a nation. I just think it's completely clear cut. But with it split on opposite sides of the continent, it's completely not obvious how you ever resolve this.
Yeah, and you really do not want to be. I mean, again, a tiny historical tidbit here. Pakistan used to be two countries, East and West Pakistan, when India originally was subdivided when the British left. And it left us with what is now Bangladesh, but was then called East Pakistan, India in the middle, and then West Pakistan. And that lasted a grand total of about 20 some odd years before they became separate countries, because you really don't want to be two countries who are one country with your biggest enemy in the middle.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's super interesting. Um, One thing that I do hope for, and again, I don't think there's any evidence-based optimism to be had here, but I do hope a little bit that people's complacency about nuclear weapons may, in retrospect, be wiped away by the Trump presidency. I worry that once we've percolated on what really happened here, that at some point people's attention may turn towards, I kind of always trusted the US government with enough nuclear weapons to wipe out the world, but maybe that's not really the right position to take.
And I think one thing that people focus on North Korea and Kim Jong Un and like the flashiness that he has, but I mean, Russia deeply worries me. Um, they obviously were able to help basically overturn the election in Trump's favor. I think that's pretty clear to everybody now who wants to take an objective look at the situation. And I don't see Putin's power degrading anytime soon with the way things are going in Russia. I think even more so than I worry about nuclear war, but I worry about the information war even more. Um, you would be surprised, Dean. There studies have been done where just memes, right? Something that seems innocuous, humor, like, oh, that's internet culture. There are dedicated pages where Russians put together memes that completely caricaturize and stereotype both sides, so Democrats and Republicans, and just constantly release this barrage of propaganda that Stalin would be Stalin's wet dream, having the ability to directly put flyers or propaganda posters in front of Americans every 5 minutes. And again, I don't see any end to that.
Yeah, when I was talking about pendulum swing and I was talking about World War II having, in my view, led to an unusually good few decades, and when I talk about institutions getting exponentially better at manipulating people while people get only generationally better at resisting, Um, I think that something is going to have to be done eventually along the lines of replacing the First Amendment with a carefully reconsidered set of prohibitions on manipulation, like making a distinction between what speech is in fact always permitted versus what things don't really count as speech, but they count as manipulation. And in a world where deciding whether having lots of AR-15s in the environment is a good thing or a bad thing is a really difficult decision to come to grips with. It's really hard to imagine how we get to recognizing that allowing this sort of manipulation is actually a bad thing, and then drawing the really difficult to draw lines around what we're going to prohibit and what we're going to allow and how we're going to explain that and how we're going to make it an actually like judgeable line in between. How do you get there?
Yeah, that's a really, I think another thing that contributes to this is, for me personally, there's a pretty large divide between these fairly massive national, at times global problems, and what do I do? What do I do as an individual? What do you do, Dean? What is your day-to-day engagement on not the consumption, but the action side?
Right. Um, I donate and I try to figure out whether donating is a cop out, if that's mostly what I do. Um,
Why would you say it's a cop-out?
Somehow money doesn't feel like deep engagement.
So money isn't deep engagement, but it is impactful. It is very, very impactful to the point that if you talk to any senator, they spend more than 50% of their working time on the phones looking for money.
Yeah. Yeah. One really cool thing that happened about, I don't know, however many few months ago, is that at a point in time where I really felt like Lauren and I both really felt like making a substantial contribution to carefully chosen Black causes or Black supporting causes. At that same time, there was this groundswell around matching those sorts of contributions. And we ended up making one of the larger contributions that we've made at a point in time where where Yelp was tripling it, and then a potential vendor of Yelp offered to match contributions of that kind. So it ended up getting quadrupled.
That's amazing. And I really think you should not undersell the value of that. While people can donate with their time or money, it really is based on what is it that they have to offer. And I think what matters most, there's a whole parable, not to quote the Bible on this, because I'm no religious nor conservative person, but there's a parable in the Bible where an old woman donates the last penny that she has and gets into heaven because it's all she had. It
Right,
doesn't matter if it's a penny.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think about this sort of thing a lot. I try to think about what we could do, should do, and I donate, and I worry about whether donating is enough.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think there are three things that I think of as pillars of being active in politics. One is being informed, like how to, like, you need to know who to support to even act first. Secondly, obviously, vote. If I could vote, I would vote. I think that's definitely something that I would look, if I eventually get a citizenship, that's something that would be the first expression of me feeling like an American, is to actually go out and vote. And
Yes.
third is offering any resources you have to the political process, which can be time, which can be money, which can be basically having a conversation with a friend. And that way, maybe you convince them to think of that issue more deeply when comes, November time or election time or whatever. And that's basically what a person can do, right? Like that, I don't think these are very huge asks of an individual. If anything, actually the hardest of these is consumption, is appropriate consumption.
Yeah, that's certainly a way of thinking about it that seems reasonable and that makes my actions seem good.
One thing that I wanted to ask you is I have a couple of friends, and it's funny because the places that I've lived in the US are exactly the ones you pointed out earlier. I've lived in New York and then I've lived in California now. So I I guess I don't really know the US. So the people I know, there's a couple I know in New York who are both children of immigrants, immensely proud Americans, really, really involved in the political process. And one of the things they tell me is focusing on the presidency is great, but not enough people focus on their local representatives. How do you engage with that?
I don't, and I should. I mean,
So I guess that answers that question.
yeah, I mean it's absolutely true. A lot of important things happen at the local and state level, but then also the feeder system for national government, to some fair degree, not entirely, but to some fair degree, goes through the state and local level. But yeah, it's just harder for me to get engaged in that. I mean, for one thing, just to be illustrative, I spend every workday working with people in California more or less all day.
That's right. And I think that's also the point where consumption of appropriate information really goes to the next order of magnitude, because these friends of mine basically are reading up on what is happening in their local government day to day.
Right?
Like
Yeah,
there's no other way to engage with it.
it's important and difficult.
It's very difficult. And I think it at that point it speaks more towards a sense, less towards a sense of duty and more towards a real deep personal interest in that process and in those people and in your community in that sense. Which, let's be honest, our environment is not really pushing us to think about the community, as you said, in ways that are basically different from any time in history before.
No, it's really true. Um, it's funny. In one particular way, the U.S. is politically still very, very stable, which is that it's really unlikely that local or state government would take an action that really affects my day to day, or that really affects my even my view of what's awful and good that's happening. You know what I mean? That would be so impactful to people that it would really wrench me emotionally. The reality is that it's the national government that takes those actions, usually not by influencing my day to day, but things like response to climate change, things like consumer protection, things like separating children from their parents at the border.
I will say though that one of the things that I really admire about the U.S. democratic framework, and the political framework, and I hope continues for a while, is the federal system. I think we can point to many different things over and over, be it things like abortion or legalization of cannabis, or even something as trivial as can you take a right on red when you're driving, that certain states are able to just try it out, see if it works, and then a wave of adoption comes afterwards. I think that makes the US really, really flexible and really, really innovative compared to a lot of other countries.
I have been laughing at myself a little bit lately, noticing that I suddenly really believe in states' rights.
No, I personally do believe in states' rights as well. I think there are blemishes on that record, especially when it comes to the Civil War, that might make you think otherwise, that sometimes a whole block of states can really be fighting for slavery, which is not a good thing and did happen. Um, but at the same time, I think the benefits far outweigh that kind of possibility happening again. That I think, again, it really makes just for example, for my own country, right? The population of my country is about 180, 190 million, so half X of US, and there's only 4 provinces, and everything is federal. There's no states' rights or like provincial rights are really not a thing.
Right.
And there's an immense amount of inertia to bringing about change that would be considered revolutionary. Whereas I see that as a process in the US where it starts in a pocket, like maybe California, maybe certain other states that are really, actually not even California. California can be conservative at times. But if it happens and if it's a good idea, it will prevail, is something that I've seen.
I agree with that. I think it's super important. And I think you gave an example of where it's important in a more, I hate to use the word extreme, but in a more extreme point of view, like California compared to the rest of the country. And I think that's true. You know, it lets California or New York be a laboratory for the rest of the country. But I also think it's important in an environment like Texas, which is much closer to the middle and much more mixed. That's an interesting and important laboratory for what kinds of consensus can be built.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think what you really want is you don't want half the states on one side and half the states on the other, because then you would only ever get 50% adoption. You really want a spectrum where I can always find a neighbor who is close enough to me who just adopted this change that I would be willing to do so.
Yes, exactly so.
Dean, let me do a quick time check with you. How are we doing on time? How much time do you have left? When do you have to run?
I'm having the should probably go kinds of thoughts.
That sounds good. So I generally always like to end with this question. What is the one thing you would have really liked to talk about or would like to leave people with that we didn't maybe touch upon?
It risks cliche, but I really do have a model of people where where I believe that people are really, really good in our most fundamental being, and that we just periodically remind ourselves of how awful we can be if we're pushed in certain ways or neglected in certain ways. And so, although I've said during this conversation that there's no evidence-based optimism at this point, I mean that in the sense of relatively immediate upcoming events, you know, like will the US democracy survive or not? But I really still see history as us very gradually learning to embrace the good side of our nature in a more stable and pervasive way. And I really do see that general trend continuing. It's just entirely possible to have a Nazi Germany as horrible punctuation along the way.
Yeah, no, I think we couldn't end on a more realistic yet optimistic note. Thanks so much for your time, Dean. This was very pleasant.
And for me also, thanks very much for setting this up.
For sure. I'll see you around.
Bye, Bassam.